Professor Lionel Tarassenko is a Professor of Electrical Engineering at the Institute of Biomedical Engineering, University of Oxford. Lionel is a Fellow of this Academy and just last month was elected to the Fellowship of the Academy of Medical Sciences. So congratulations on that election, Lionel. It's a great achievement to receive such an accolade in more than one sector. Lionel has been the holder of the chair in electrical engineering at Oxford since 1997. He was the director of the University of Oxford Institute of Biomedical Engineering from its opening in April 2008 until going on sabbatical leave in October 12, and in 2009 became the director of the Centre of Excellence in Medical Engineering, funded by the Wellcome Trust and EPSRC. As the holder of no less than 24 patents and founder of a number of companies, Lionel's specialism is signals processing systems based on neural networks. Lionel, you are doing a great job as chair of the Academy's panel for biomedical engineering, and I think you are going to touch on some of the recent work of that group this afternoon. So a very warm welcome indeed to Professor Lionel Tarassenko.
Thank you very much, John, for this introduction. So it's my task to introduce the array of stellar speakers we've got this afternoon by trying to set the context for today's Innovation In. And we're very glad that the Academy has made this one of the first few Innovation In meetings that it has held. There was a very successful one in the automotive industry at the beginning of the year, and I hope today's will be just as successful as that meeting was just a few months ago. Now, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, a definition of medical technology. There are a number of definitions, but I hope that you'll be happy with this one. It's to do with diagnosis, management, or treatment of disease using the techniques of science and engineering. There are many examples. In fact, this comes from doing a talk to sixth formers. So from time to time, most of us in academia talk to sixth formers about why they should come and study a particular subject at university. And what has really happened in the last decade is the awareness amongst the sixth form of medical technology, biomedical engineering has really grown. And this is a list that they came up with when I said, look, give me some examples. And this is their list the last time I gave this talk. In fact, there was another slide in which we went on to look at some of these in more detail. So this is just a list of examples of medical technology. I've highlighted in red the 3 technologies that will be featured in the first section this afternoon. Now, we're still basking in the glory of London 2012, and the last time I gave this talk was just before the Olympics, or a similar talk was just before the Olympics. So I used the Olympic rings to try and characterize the innovation ecosystem. It is a complex one. There are multiple stakeholders, and what I'd like to do is to go through each ring one after the other in the next 20 minutes or so and highlight, and it will be a selective highlight because in 20 minutes I can't cover everything that's going on in the UK, so I apologize for being selective, but that's the only way I could convey anything meaningful. So let's start with academia, and here I'm going to highlight 4 centers of excellence simply because 4 years ago now, in 2009, Wellcome Trust and EPSRC got together to try and give a serious input, a serious step change in the amount of research that was being done in medical engineering in academic centres in this country. And it chose 4 universities, Imperial, King's, Oxford and Leeds, and awarded roughly £10 million to each centre to try and do serious things in medical engineering, all with slightly different missions. I'm not going to describe the mission of each centre. Leeds and Imperial will be represented in the next 2 talks. I'll say a little bit about what we're doing in Oxford, not just my work, but work of colleagues as well. And I've got one slide from the director of the Centre of Excellence at King's College, Professor Reza Rezavi, who's actually a clinician rather than an engineer. And they've just spun out their first company about 6 months ago, a company, Sidar Limited, which was incorporated at the end of last year. And the idea is to take some CT images of a patient prior to a fairly complex operation to treat aortic aneurysms, in other words, to make sure that the blood flow is restored, that there isn't a chance of the aneurysm bursting. So there's a surgical intervention. During the surgical intervention, you use real-time fluoroscopy, but you can have it set precisely from a preoperative CT scan. However, of course, the two sets of images are not registered, and they've developed technology to do exactly that and spun it out into a company, and they're just about to go into clinical trials. And the issue, clinical trials, will come back in this talk on several occasions. In Oxford, our spin-out is called OxyHealth. It's about the use of smartphones and tablets for healthcare, multiple uses, for example, telehealth for chronic disease, with an emphasis on self-management and integrating with clinical pathways. So we're not trying to redesign the clinical pathways in the NHS, we're trying to enhance them with appropriate use of technology. The long-term idea is to make it as easy for the patient to use, and the easiest way to monitor a patient for the patient, not for the clinician or the engineer, is to have no electrodes at all. So how do we do that? Well, we're developing a product which is, at the moment, in inverted commas, and I have to use inverted commas, otherwise I might be sued by Microsoft to own Skype. We're calling it Health Skype. In other words, when these patients with heart failure or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, might be Skyping their grandkids, because they tend to be elderly, the patients, they will be monitored without them having to do anything, simply by measuring the reflected ambient light, and from that deriving the heart rate, deriving the breathing rate, and some idea of oxygen levels. So this is technology that we have working in the lab. There are a number of spin-outs in the US trying to do this as well. We believe we have more clinical data than any other center around the world, and we're rolling it out into the company OxyHealth. So quite a lot going on in academia, but of course engineers cannot do this on their own. In fact, they can do nothing on their own unless there's a partnership with healthcare professionals. And one of the advantages of the Centers of Excellence is that it's given us, as engineers, a huge amount of credibility with our clinical colleagues. Why? Because the Wellcome Trust is the biggest funder of medical research in this country, bigger than MRC. And so most of our colleagues in universities up and down the land who work in clinical departments or in medical schools are funded, have their research funded by the Wellcome Trust. The fact that Wellcome Trust had allocated, together with EPSRC, £40 million to medical engineering has given us a huge amount of credibility with our clinical colleagues. So we have about 30 postdoctoral research assistants in engineering, but as many as 15 clinical research fellows. And for the first time, the clinical research fellows are coming to an engineering department to do their doctorates. So, for example, here you have Dr. David Meredith, one of our clinical research fellows, ST3, ST4, if you know the nomenclature in medical training, taking 3 years out from his training eventually to become a consultant in renal medicine, to develop better techniques to monitor patients during dialysis to avoid the main problem of dialysis, which is intradialytic hypertension, sudden catastrophic drops in blood pressure during dialysis with lots of negative consequences. So he's been working with us as a registrar of renal medicine, taking 3 years out of his clinical training to work with engineers to develop the next generation of technology in monitoring patients during dialysis. And we're very proud of the fact that if you look on the right, I don't expect you to read the paper. Maybe if you get slightly bored in the first row, you might just be able to read it. But what I want you to notice is that he's the first author because he did most of the draft, but it's published in the Journal Medical Engineering and Technology. So here's a medic publishing in the Journal of Medical Engineering and Technology. And of course, we're very proud of the opposite. This is one of our own undergraduates who stayed on to do her doctorate in medical engineering in our institute. And She was working on the problem of pediatric triage. When a kid presents to accident and emergency, do they have meningitis or is it one of the common diseases of childhood? A very difficult decision for the person who's trying to assess that kid, possibly crying and so on. So we tried to improve the instrumentation that they use in order to make that decision, so improve the pediatric triage of these kids. One thing that we realized very quickly is that, of course, as you go from being a baby to a young kid to an older kid, an adolescent, your heart rate slows down to the value you'll eventually have as an adult, as your resting heart rate, and the same for your breathing rate. There are tables of these values. They're vastly out of date. So we went through the literature, found 150,000 data points on heart rate, 4,000 on breathing rate, all at different ages, sometimes age bands, sometimes precise age, used the techniques of signal processing, pattern recognition as a form of kernel regression that we use to redesign these, and got it published in Lancet. So you have an engineering PhD student here, first author in the Lancet paper. Multidisciplinarity, working close together, means that engineers can actually publish in the Lancet. If we look outwards from Oxford, actually look on a global scale, and if you notice the blue word here at the top, frugal, this is signposting a little bit the presentation that will be given by Professor Robin Norton. The multidisciplinary partnership extends outside the boundaries of the developed world to the developing world. So we partner with clinicians in the developing world, in countries like South Africa, India, even China. And a lot of it, again, is around this because this is truly ubiquitous. There are more phones now than there are people in the world. And so we use it with low-cost sensors, as in this project, for example, in South Africa, working with the University of Cape Town and some consultants in cardiology in that university, to develop an M stethoscope, if you will, a mobile phone which can act as a stethoscope because you use the hands-free microphone here together with an egg cup to record heart sounds in rural Africa to screen kids for rheumatic heart disease, which is a great problem in sub-Saharan Africa. Or in India, working in partnership with the George Institute for Global Health, and Robin will tell you more about this, trying to use some way of healthcare delivery which has been phenomenally successful in India, which is ASHAs. These women who got basic primary school education and have been very good in terms of vaccination, in terms of childhood diseases, reducing infant mortality hugely in India over the last decade. And now can we use them to do more? Screen people for cardiovascular disease risk, for example. Many Indian men don't have the right diet, have strokes in their 40s and 50s, may not kill them, but reduces their quality of life and takes away the main wage earner for the next 20, 30 years. So here they're being trained in Andhra Pradesh by some of the local doctors to use our Android app. This is the local language, Telugu. And then you can see them using it in their local center with a female patient here. Here's the ASHA. You can just see the blood pressure cuff maybe and the blood pressure monitor. And it's a kind of barometer type display for people to understand, in this case, that the risk is very low. There are various sliders you can use to say, well, if you reduce your systolic blood pressure, how much your risk will be lowered by, etc. It's very pictorial. It's about trying to screen people here for cardiovascular disease in rural India. Healthcare professionals were right at the center, and chosen to be right at the center of the Olympic risk deliberately is the patient. The patient has to be at the center. And so, for example, in Oxford, when we design our applications, whether it's for COPD or heart failure patients, we invite patients to what we call co-design workshops. We make them understand how important they are in the whole process. By the way, all patients featured on these slides have agreed for their pictures to be shown. And we show them early prototypes and involve them in the design. And this is absolutely essential. This is different from what you do with jet engines, what you do in the automotive industry. You are monitoring a human being. They have to be part of the loop right at the beginning. So we have co-design workshops, and this one was organized with the George Institute in Oxford. And whether we like it or not, they will be at the center because social media are making it possible for them to be the center. So you may have heard of these social media networks, Cure Together, for example, a social network site where people can record their symptoms, trying to make them active partners in the research. The one which is probably most famous is Patients Like Me, which has got 110,000 members now and has actually effectively done clinical trials of rare diseases with medicines that had never been tried on more than 50 or 60 patients, literally on thousands, because of the ability to connect these people via social media. So it's becoming a very powerful tool for putting patients at the center of innovation in medical technologies. Industry is very important. Sir John has already mentioned the sector, which is a vibrant sector. My figures are slightly older. John quoted 16 billion in 2012, it was 15 in 2011. The number of companies you see there. But the interesting thing is 2/3 have been around for 10 years or more, but 99% of them employ fewer than 250 people. So it is really an SME sector. In fact, 60% of them employ fewer than 10 people. So these are small and occasionally medium enterprises. Quite often university spin-outs, but not necessarily so. And what happens in the sector is the big players tend to spend the major proportion of their R&D budget to support existing product ranges, perhaps incrementally, and let the SMEs do the disruptive innovation, because that de-risks it for them. And if the innovation is successful, then the SME will probably be bought by a Johnson & Johnson or a Medtronic or a Smith & Nephew and so on. That's what tends to happen in the sector. And if you want to look up some of these success stories, you can look them up on the web. Apotec, Gyrus Medical, Inverness Medical, bought by Johnson & Johnson, and Organox that I shall mention very briefly, because there was a lot of publicity around Organox about 3 or 4 months ago. And Organox is a company set up by Professor of Biomedical Engineering in Oxford, a colleague of mine, Konstantin Kousios, and a Professor of Transplantation, Professor Peter FREng. And what they're trying to do there is deal with a mismatch in terms of organ transplant. So there are 30,000 patients in Europe and the USA on the liver transplant waiting list, but only 12,000 transplants are done each year. And that's because at least 1/3 of the potential donors, or at least one of the principal reasons, potential donor organs are discarded because of the way they're preserved at the moment, cold preservation. And what happens is lots of issues around when the machine is switched off, but very often it's switched off, the heart is no longer beating, support is withdrawn from the patient, but before the organ can be cooled for cryopreservation, it sustains warm hypoxic damage and can't be used and gets discarded. Creates a lot of distress for the family that allowed the organ transplant to go ahead, for the potential donor who's been got ready, for the surgical team who's got gowned up, etc. So what Organox has been addressing is normothermic, so doing organ perfusion at room temperature with a complete liver support control system here. I won't go through all, but it's effectively allowing the liver to exist outside the body at room temperature until it's ready to go for transplantation into the patient. And you can see in pictures, the picture's worth 1,000 words. If we dim the lights, we probably would see it slightly better. This is the start. The organ, the liver, is fairly grey, but already after 10 seconds and after 60 seconds, you can see, thank you very much, Beverly, the organ has already more or less come back to life because it is being supported by this complex piece of engineering, a feedback control system that is allowing it to be supported until it's ready for transplantation. And you may have seen this on BBC News. It was featured in mid-March. Here's my colleague, Professor Kousios, being interviewed by the BBC Health correspondent. It was featured on a number of sites, etc. And the clinical trials ongoing at King's College Hospital are going on extremely well at the moment. Final piece, the fifth ring, is regulators. Clinical trials have been mentioned several times in my presentation. I'm sure will be mentioned again this afternoon. Hugely important in this sector. The whole clinical trial field was designed for the pharmaceutical industry. It doesn't entirely fit the medical device industry. So we recognize this, And working in partnership with the Academy of Medical Sciences, we set up a roundtable forum earlier this year where half the people were engineers and the other half were clinicians, mostly but not exclusively surgeons, to try and understand how we could do something to move the agenda forward in terms of clinical trials for medical devices, the whole area of regulation of medical devices. And I hope all of you have been given a copy of this report, which we're launching today. I'm not going to go through it in detail. I've highlighted here 4 or 5 of the recommendations that you'll see in the executive summary. First of all, there's quite a lot in the aircraft and transport industry in engineering in terms of hazard analysis, safety functional requirements that could be translated to medical devices for the benefit of that particular field. The regulatory framework should not be monolithic. What you need to introduce a new device at the beginning is probably a randomized controlled trial, but if you're going to have iterations of the device or adjust it or have a new generation incrementally, you shouldn't have to redo another randomized controlled trial. So the regulatory framework should be adaptive according to the lifetime or where in the lifetime of the device we are at the moment. We heard a lot about notified bodies. If any of you have tried to get medtech innovation out there being used in a hospital or in a home, you have to have it CE marked. If you're going to be successful in the US, you have to have FDA approval. There are some issues around notified bodies. It is an issue we're aware of. The EU is tackling it at the moment, but it's something that has to be tackled because it's not working very well at the moment. And finally, and a lot of people are beginning to recognize this, there's a big announcement by the Prime Minister back in November. The NHS, with its unique patient identifier, has huge potential to recruit patients into device trials at different generations. Whereas for somebody in the US born, say, in California, who then studies on the East Coast and then goes to work in Colorado, they will have 3 or 4 different healthcare systems during that time, and it's almost impossible to track them through that. The NHS is literally cradle to grave, and is a huge resource here for clinical trials if we can get the databases issue, patients' privacy and security issues sorted out. And Jeremy Hunt has told us we have to sort them out by 2015 or 2016. So, to conclude, before handing over to the next speakers, I hope I've been able to convince you that there are many stakeholders in innovation in medical technologies. It's a multidisciplinary enterprise, but the key thing, the central ring, is the patient at the center. The centers of excellence, which are now coming to the end of year 4, and will finish in September 2014, because they're 5-year fundings, and there will be a big meeting in which the key results will be presented in about a year to 18-month time. I've had a big impact on medtech research here in this country, and I've really brought together, as I hope to try to describe, healthcare professionals, clinicians doing academic research together with engineers. The regulatory environment is what is absolutely crucial to our sector. We have to have evidence. Medicine is evidence-based medicine in the 21st century. You have to have evidence of efficacy and safety of your device. And that is a huge burden that the VC community, for example, has to be made aware of and understand fully if it is going to invest into new SMEs, new university spin-outs that try and bring these devices to the market. The US market, in many ways, because you have 50 states operating under a federal system of reimbursement with some local but minor variation, is a much more attractive market than the European market, because the laws for reimbursement in France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Germany, Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway are all different. And for an SME, it's very difficult to try and tackle these differences and see where they fit, whereas in the US, it tends to be monolithic. So it's absolutely key for a medtech industry to be present in the US. However, there are difficulties about being a UK company trying to establish yourself in the US. And DBS is aware of it. It is something that the industry is asking for help with, and maybe what is being negotiated at G8 now in terms of these bilateral trade agreements will help to facilitate that. But don't let me leave you with a negative note, because all of these are challenges, things that we could do better, things that we need to do in a more efficient manner, maybe to make the sector even more successful. But what I want to leave you with as a concluding point, it is a thriving sector. Remember, £16 billion of turnover with very active SMEs and a great pipeline of innovation from UK universities. Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Tarassenko, and you certainly got us off to a great start. I think you've given me great encouragement that engineers have certainly come up in the world if you can get yourself published in the Lancet. So we're going to take questions for just 5 minutes from Professor Tarassenko, and I will chair it from here, and I'll take the first question. Hands up, and here we are, and the microphone will reach you. It's good if you would say your name as well, so all present who you are and where you come from. Yeah.
Hello. I just speak. We should go. I'm Pankaj from University of Edinburgh. I was just wondering, the last bit you were talking about SMEs and the industry. The talk as an engineer, which I hear from our surgeons, is many of the surgeons here in the UK, they do large quantity of operations. So they're not as keen on new technology because they're good with their hands. Whereas in the US, they might be more amenable to new technologies. Do you think that plays a role?
Well, I'm not sure it's necessarily true talking to the local surgeons in Oxford. Obviously, we can only talk about the people we know. For example, we are probably overrepresented this Academy of Medical Sciences, Royal Academy of Engineering round table. There are different ways of practicing surgery, absolutely, and there are some dangers in the US. It is certainly the case that surgeons are probably too close in some ways to the medtech industry. And the FDA has had to step in at various times. But it's nevertheless the case as well. We had, in fact, if you look in this report, there's the director for, I'm trying to think of the participant discussion for the Royal College of Surgeons, who gave a very interesting piece. And there is a tradition in this country of clinical trials, multi-center randomized control trials in surgery. And proportionally, we probably do as many, if not more, than the US, given the relative sizes of the UK and the US. So I'm not sure that surgeons are not willing. They probably don't work as closely with industry, but they do as many randomized control trials in the US proportionally.
Another question?
Present what seems to be a very rosy picture of the medtech sector in this country, but there are certainly things that have become better. I'm curious if you have suggestions.
So I'm not sure I heard the question. It's what can we do better?
Yes.
Was that the question?
Yeah, I think that's the question.
Yes.
It's very important that speakers hold the microphone close to their mouth.
Well, I mean, we had a meeting, the first meeting, in fact, of the community of practice for medical technologies this morning downstairs. And there are definitely things that we can do better at all sorts of levels. So I think one thing which is progressing is a better interface with our clinical colleagues. I did my own doctorate 30 years ago now in Oxford, and medical engineering didn't exist. My doctorate was actually in pediatrics. Engineers were sort of glorified technicians. So I think the profession now, and that's why I put the Lancet article, we can publish in the Lancet as engineers. So in one generation, there's been a complete turnaround in the view of the medical profession has of engineering, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. I think the battle was not completely won, but we're mostly there. So the interface working with the medical professions is much better than it used to be. There is still an issue around the cost of clinical trials. I mean, I did hint at this briefly. Clinical trials have been developed primarily for the pharmaceutical industry, which effectively has a 20-25 year timescale from the lab to the end of the patent. And they can afford, with the size of the companies that they are, to invest literally millions into clinical trials. Much harder for an SME to find the same sums of money, and it's all to do with the valley of death. Until you've done that clinical trial, you're not attractive enough either for the next round of investment or to be bought out by one of the large companies. So I think trying to design clinical trials that fit the medical devices industry is one of the issues, and that's what we've begun to address in here. There's a lot more work to be done. Taking it away from the pharmaceutical industry, making it much more fit for purpose for our industry. The final thing I'd like to add, although I could have a long list, is reporting of adverse events. So we were talking both at this round table and again this morning, the fact that if there is a train crash, if there's a plane crash and so on, there is reporting, and somebody will, Dr. Chris Elliott will be talking about this later on, so I won't go into too much detail. The pilot will be interviewed, the train driver will be interviewed with no liability or legal liability unless they've been negligent hanging over them. This doesn't happen in the medical sector. So surgeons would like to be able, that's what they told us when we had this round table with them, to be able to report the things that go wrong occasionally, but because they've got this huge Damocles sword hanging over them, they don't. And that's got to be to the detriment of the industry. And that's true not just for surgery, which is obviously high risk, but the whole of the medical devices industry. The reporting of adverse events, the regulatory framework, the risk assessment methods could be improved.
One more question. Yes.
I'm Beverly Parkin from the Royal Academy of Engineering. I really enjoyed your presentation. What I'd like to ask you now is, are you upbeat about the NHS and its uptake with innovation now and into the future?
I think if you work with the NHS, you have to have stamina. So I've been at it for a while. You have to be prepared. So my meeting tomorrow morning, we're trialing a new way of linking the observations together with bedside monitors in accident and emergency in Oxford. The meeting is at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. We will only be able to meet with the nurses and the consultants in emergency medicine before they start their day. And that's a fact of life. We cannot change the working conditions of the NHS. Their patients must be their primary responsibility. Even those who do research all are active clinicians. Therefore, if you want to introduce innovation, you have to have stamina. That means meeting at 7 a.m. in the morning. It's not very family friendly, I recognise. Not easier for me now. My youngest child's 21, so I can do 7 o'clock meetings, no problem. Or 7 p.m. I think there's a great deal of goodwill from the medical profession to innovate and to innovate in medical technology. There are tremendous obstacles, but let's not concentrate on the obstacles. There are people out there willing to work with us to make it happen. You just have to be prepared to have stamina and occasionally to bang your head against a brick wall 20 times before the first brick starts to be dislodged. But there are things that have improved. For example, medical research ethics used to be an incredible Byzantine process. It's much easier now. The procedures to get a research study done in the NHS are much easier. NIHR, National Institute of Health Research, has been a breath of fresh air. So yes, problems, but it is becoming better.
Well,
the bottom is half full, rather than half empty.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Tarassenko. I think we should... you're welcome to dine and come up.